This is real life, and we all have our moments. It's hard. It's hard to be a human on this planet right now, and there are many people who are kind of burying their head in the sand and just, going for the zombie thing because it's easier. And one thing that I will say that is my big message right now is the majority of the people on the planet want to live in a generous way. If you can become in any way an inspiration to another human being, that's a victory.
I'm so excited to have you on the program today, Sara. I think you need no introduction, but you're such an inspiration to women's health and what's happening on the planet right now. And I think one of the most important conversations about women's health, 3-time New York Times bestseller, your most recent book called Younger, and it sounds like you're writing a book right now, which I want to hear more about. But welcome to Reality Riffing, and thank you for spending some time with us, and thank you for all the work you're doing. Really, really very important. Very meaningful to me and many, many women, and I'm sure the men and other genders that love them. So, all of us. So welcome. Me too. So tell me, we were just talking about our both love of Kendrick Lamar. Tell me something else we don't know about you. Like, I bet people didn't know that you loved Kendrick Lamar, but what else don't we know about you? Give us something juicy.
Well, I grew up in Alaska. That's where I let the wilderness into my heart. So the wilderness is a big part of my lifestyle medicine, kind of my daily protocol for how to take care of myself and serve the best that I can and serve my mission.
Yeah.
So Alaska is a big part of the untold story.
Beautiful.
My husband is from Los Angeles, and Venice is my second favorite place on the planet. So I spent a lot of time down there. I need to come meet you and come to your institute.
We would love to have you. It would be an honor, and it would be a great honor. And Venice has its own medicine. It has its own wilderness medicine. It's a different type of wilderness. Yeah. And is there a way that you kind of take that medicine in? Like, is there a way that you particularly like the wilderness medicine? Is there a protocol for you around that?
Yeah, there's a protocol. So I'm kind of science girl. So yeah. I really feel like, one of the issues, especially for women, is that we've been experimented upon. Yeah. Whether it's antidepressants or hormone therapy. And so I have a really high bar when it comes to the scientific evidence that I want behind the things that I say. And what we know, this mostly comes from Japan, where they have this whole field of study called forest medicine, forest bathing. And we know that 20 minutes spent in the forest will decrease your cortisol, that main stress hormone. It decreases cortisol. 45 minutes improves your cognitive function. Now, if you could do some Kundalini in the forest, man, you got it. Like, you're all set.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, that's the add. I always say, add Kundalini to anything you're doing, and it'll help enhance the experience. That is definitely the way. It's like yerba mate, which is my favorite. It has every single vegetable and sea salt. Do you know that spice? That's the Kundalini.
I think I know. I need to know that spice, but yeah, it's I like to think of lifestyle medicine as additive. I think a lot of people kind of think of it as restrictive. It's sort of I don't want to deprive myself, but really we're talking about additions. Yeah. We're talking about enhancements, augmentations.
In terms of now you're kind of in that, you're going deeper and deeper into your lineage, your legacy of what, you've done, these kind of monumental pieces of your work. And now I'm feeling, I don't know exactly what this next book is about, but you're going deeper into this kind of dharma and this legacy that you're leaving. And what are you finding in terms of right now on the planet with the women's movement as it is, with the consciousness as it is, with the what we're facing? I mean, in my opinion, we're at war for women's health, as you have said. And I mean that not in an angry way, but just if you look at what happens to women on a daily basis in 2018 with their health and their health practitioners and the propaganda and everything that's happening. What do you think, what's your biggest kind of agenda or thing that feels like our biggest hurdle right now?
Well, there's a lot of hurdles. The one that comes to mind immediately as you're talking is misogyny. You know, the ways that we fight women and keep them down. And it's not that so much as the hurdle as the way that we've internalized it as women. So I feel like, and I do this myself, you know, I'm constantly unearthing ways that I have like a little victimology around something that's going on. And it's on me to step up, speak my truth, you know, be bold about it. Mm-hmm. And to say it in a way that can be received. So I think we're seeing that with the Me Too movement. I think we're seeing it with, you know, in smaller ways in conventional medicine, people who are just like, listen, our healthcare system is broken. Like, this is not working. We need a new strategy for how to conceive of health, how to manifest health. And so I would say that kind of internalization is maybe the biggest hurdle. So the way around it, of course, is to talk about it and to have, you know, and here's maybe the bigger challenge, to have a model of wholeness, like to have a model of living in this world where you are fully expressed. And that's something that I see with your work. And we need more models of wholeness. Yeah. You know, and yoga offers that. You know, that's one of the reasons why I was so drawn to yoga and became a yoga teacher 15 years ago. But it's we need to talk about it in broader terms, which is another thing that I absolutely love about your platform.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I've been using this word not publicly actually, but this is the conversation I'm having kind of internally and with some practitioners that I really trust, is that I feel that there's a mutation process happening in some way of the, you know, how the new era of leaders in models of wholeness is the kind of term you're using, but how we mutate literally, I think. I mean, there's a epigenetic mutation. There's obviously there's a, you know, karmic, dharmic, there's energetic mutations. There's, you know, you could put all sorts of different aspects of the mutation, but really how to create this kind of transparent model of true health. And it doesn't look like a, you know, it doesn't look like an overview, perfect picture of some, you know, vegan, you know, pastel vegan food that I've eaten today. Or, I mean, you know, these ideas and aesthetics and things that are running through wellness as the industry is kind of reaching critical mass, which is a beautiful moment that this is what's happening on the planet. But I think that what's necessary for kind of the true leadership is this almost mutation process that has to happen like inside our cell bodies. It's like a mitochondrial and pineal and pituitary kind of, and you know, requires twerking, requires meditating, requires walking in the forest, like all these things. And it's messy, you know, just like any mutation. So I do feel like we're kind of in the midst of that in what it, you know, creating new models of leaders and leadership. And so it is
yeah, well, let's riff on this because this is such a good topic. You know, I think a lot of people think of mutation as being a negative word. Mm-hmm. As a scientist, I think of it positively and negatively. You can also kind of think of it in a neutral way. But what we need evolution.
Yeah.
And you can't have evolution without mutation. So mutation is kind of how you you solve the problems that you're facing. It's how you face those obstacles and overcome them. And so, our ancestors who had to survive a famine, they developed the mutations that led to insulin resistance that kind of make you fat no matter what you do.
Right.
And so, that allows you to survive a famine. But when I'm trying to fit into my genes, don't like that so much.
No, it's like, thanks a lot.
But that's how our genetics work. And there's also these workarounds. You described epigenetics. We have kind of our DNA that we're stuck with that changed a lot, millions of years ago. And now we have these workarounds. We have ways of evolving as leaders and as people who carry the light. And only about 10% of your risk of disease is genetic. 90% is your environment. And we have a lot of control over that environment. And so I think part of what you're speaking to is, as leaders, we got to speak to that environment. We got to speak to, the answer may not necessarily be the Instagram vegan photo that's all in pastels, as you described. Mm-hmm. It may not just be forest bathing. Like, we also have to deal with the way we talk to each other, the way we set up the intention for the day, the way that we wish for something and let it go, the way that we let it go. One of my biggest issues in my 30s was that I sucked at letting things go. Yes. And I had this kind of victim-y way of, I'm working so hard, I'm so tired. And like, cortisol was kind of running the show. And I had to kind of wrestle with cortisol, to find my own mutation, my own sort of positive evolution.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that part of the dark side of the women's movement in terms of like true health for women is that all of the kind of issues, the stress related diseases that men have held being in the patriarchal kind of structures, this is what now women are going to be up against, I think, more and more. And women, it shows up maybe differently. So it shows up in, weight gain. Maybe it's not a heart attack, but it's the insulin resistance that you speak of, or aging a certain way, or menopause a certain way, or just not being able to have a child, fertility issues, but these kind of stress related. And I find this part really fascinating. I think it's the part because we're early on what women leading the free world, and women taking more of these leadership roles in politics and in business and all these kind of ways, what it's going to look like if we don't look at the other side of how these things affect our mental, emotional, psycho-emotional, and physical, and the way we age and all this kind of stuff. And so I find this to be a very fascinating topic, because we don't, men have, like, classically, they die earlier, they have heart attacks. These are the stress of these kind of being the leaders of the, whatever in the age of the patriarchy. So now in the matriarchy, what's that dark side look like? What's the toxic kind of dark side of? And I think we're seeing it in some different ways. And it's why this conversation of hormones, like, nobody was really talking about hormones not that long ago.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the dark side, I can sort of list them for you. We know that women have double the rates of depression as men do. They have double the rates of anxiety, sometimes much more than that. They've got 10 to 20x the rate of thyroid problems. Our hormonal system is so much more complex compared to a man's hormonal system, not to dismiss them in any way, but,
right.
We have babies, we go through perimenopause, we go through menstruation. Like, we are much more complex beings, and we've got to acknowledge that. Yep. So yes, the dark side shows up in other ways. It shows up as belly fat. It shows up as moodiness and irritability. But we also have an advantage. The original, I'm going to go back a little bit in time. Can we have a science moment?
I'm so into it. I was waiting for it. I've been trying to bait it. I was just waiting on bated breath.
Yeah. Well, so in the 1930s, there was this guy at Harvard Medical School who discovered the fight-flight system, the stress response system.
Right.
His name was Walter Cannon. and he studied men, of course, and he found, he sort of looked at cortisol and adrenaline and what happens when you face a stressor. And he found that men respond with either fight or flight. And it was assumed for until the 1980s, so 50 plus years, that also applies to women.
Right.
And women are not little men. Like we're very different, and we have fight, flight, freeze. Women tend to freeze. We also have an adaptive mechanism, which is something that I think we really need to leverage more as we go forward as leaders, and that is to tend and befriend. So the tend and befriend process in the female body is what creates a lot of, kind of endocrinological harmony.
Right.
So connecting with others, and this makes sense from an evolutionary point of view, because, if you're a 200-pound man with big guns, like your deltoids and biceps are gigantic, and you've got a tiger coming after you, like fight or flight, you've got some good chances there. But if you're, a 140-pound woman with a toddler in one arm and a baby in the other, and you've got a tiger coming after you, like it's not going to go well.
Right.
So if you tend and befriend, if you've got your tribe, you've got your people that you're connected with, you've got protection, you've got, the sentries that are kind of looking out for you, that works a lot better. Yeah. So we have to find ways to tend and befriend. So we all have our methods, some more effective than others.
Yeah.
And those are the pathways that we need to leverage.
What have they found in terms of tend and befriend in the neuroscience and biochemistry? Are there things that actually work better when it comes to the hormonal cascade? Yeah,
well, something as simple as calling a girlfriend can make such a difference in terms of the cascade, the neuroendocrine cascade. I sort of think about it as a dashboard. You've got your hormones on one side. This is sort of the brain-body connection, super simplified. So you've got your hormones on one side. And for women, I think of those as three main hormones, the hormonal Charlie's Angels.
Right.
So cortisol, estrogen, thyroid. Right. And for the guys, I think of it as the three amigos. That's cortisol, testosterone, and thyroid. So for a woman, what we know is that calling a girlfriend, spending 15, 20, 30 minutes on the phone, or meeting a girlfriend, going to yoga, like all of those things help you deepen these pathways in the brain.
Right.
And it helps you cope with stress. We all have stressors that come up. But if you internalize it, kind of press it inward, that's what leads to the anxiety and the depression and the hormone imbalance. And if you don't isolate, if you reach out and ask for help, it makes a huge difference in your health.
Yeah, I mean, we know that in all of the yogic science, we understand particularly women, the communal kind of experience or the community experience, what that does. And I think, of course, I love that Western science is catching up to all of these things we've known. There's also something Yogi Bhajan says that I think you'll find fascinating. He says that basically it's thought that a woman's metabolism is somehow weaker, or somehow, we have to eat less than men, or we have to eat less as we age than men, and just kind of these ideas. And it's easier for men to lose weight than it is for us. And not that is not true in certain ways, but his point is that actually a woman's metabolism is the most powerful thing in the universe. It actually created the universe, and the metabolic, a woman's body, all of her metabolic processes are literally the metabolic processes of the universe itself, or the creative force itself. And that the kind of tapping into that power is really a rewiring of all sorts of aspects of power for women. And I've been meditating on that a lot, because I feel like I understand it cognitively, but also like where the body actually starts to understand that in the more kind of visceral experience. That's what I've been actually my personal practice of, like, I'm a woman under a lot of stress. I'm a leader. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm all these things that we are. And I understand understand that from a spiritual standpoint, and then where's like the blood I can't think of the barrier between that being something I understand from a spiritual standpoint, and then how it shows up in actually the metabolic power in my physical body, which I don't have an answer to, but maybe you have some science behind that, because that's something like I've been meditating on, like where is that place where that starts to kind of embody into a reality, because it certainly makes sense. And when I say that to any woman, I see her go, yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I love this. Totally love this. And I don't have, like a simple answer, but I have a few ways in that we can maybe riff about.
Yeah.
So I totally agree with what he said. And I don't think of it as women's metabolism, men's metabolism as like a one up, one down thing. I think of it more as we're different, we evolve differently, we have our own advantages. We're, in many ways, women are more adaptive. And I think that's part of what creates this metabolic grace that he's talking about.
Right.
I think also, you're absolutely right that Western medicine is, 2,500 years behind yogic science in terms of, finding the evidence for this. But one of the things we know is that a woman who is in hormonal balance, I think, is unstoppable. And there's not like one single protocol that gets a woman into like this perfect hormonal place. And I don't even like that word perfect. I like to kind of think of, okay, what's your particular story with your hormones? What are the ways that we make those little micro adjustments and get your hormones functioning at their optimal place? How do we get those hormones talking to the neurotransmitters, the brain chemistry in your body, so that neurohormonal dashboard is really optimized? And, one of the ways of measuring it, I think you're asking a little bit about, what do we know from a scientific point of view in terms of kind of objectively looking at this?
Yeah.
We know that a woman who is low in inflammation, generally that woman has the kind of metabolism that we're talking about, that kind of metabolic grace.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different causes of inflammation. But this is also, this is one of our strengths as women. It's also one of our weaknesses. Women have much higher rates of autoimmune conditions, things like Hashimoto's and celiac and other problems. But you can measure inflammation, and we know that yoga reduces inflammation. Like, it's totally measurable. You can look at interleukin 6 levels in someone who practices yoga regularly. They have much less inflammation. And when I use that term, I think of inflammation as being kind of like this frat party that's happening in the body that you don't want to be happening in the body. Like, it's, like beer is flying and broken glasses, all sorts of badness. Like, you don't want inflammation in the body. One of the ways of having the longest possible health span, that period of time where you feel fantastic, when you're able to serve and really, define your mission and kind of be pulled forward by your purpose, you need to have as little inflammation as possible to be in that state of grace.
Yeah.
So I think inflammation is one way in. I can think about a few others. I also think about what the Dalai Lama said about how the world is going to be saved by Western women. I'm not sure I agree about the Western part, but I do think that it's on us as women to step up. There's such a void right now in terms of leadership, in terms of, just really brainstorming and heart-storming about where we need to go as a species.
Yes.
And it is on us to solve these puzzles that we're facing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can't do it if your hormones are a total hot mess.
You can't. You can't. I mean, this is something that I talk about, and obviously you're calling it the endocrine hormonal dashboard. Is that the term you use?
I use neurohormonal dashboard.
Neurohormonal.
I think I'm a little more of a geek than you are. maybe.
I mean, I love meeting someone who's more of a geek than I am. That's not possible. You won. No, I love it. But so something that in the yogic science kind of philosophy is that if that is off, you can't actually hold states of compassion for yourself or others. You can't not be short with your kids or your husband or your employees or your coworkers. It's actually, and so there's that's where we get the kind of biology and the neurobiology of consciousness. Of some sort of evolution. And I think that's a point of also self-compassion, because, I mean, of course, we're never obnoxious, but if somebody else is being obnoxious, so you can have compassion for someone else when they're being obnoxious, when they're being irritable, when they're being whatever, not generous. That is an endocrine and hormone depletion and imbalance.
It is. It's one of the key signs. I heard you talk on one of your previous podcasts about one of the symptoms, like a chief symptom of your hormones being out of whack, is that you're obnoxious. Yeah. And I love that, because I think it really simplifies and kind of cuts through a lot of the scientific noise when it comes to hormones. And it's true. I would say, I've been looking recently at this idea of compassionate presence. Towards yourself, because as women, we're so bad at that. Towards ourselves. We're better at it towards other people.
Right.
We're wired to over provide, especially during the period of our reproductive years. That time from your 20s until perimenopause, which starts in your 40s. So we're wired to over provide and give until we drop, and that depletes your hormones. So I think getting into that place where your hormones are in balance, one of the ways that is that you have that state of presence, that state of compassionate presence. Mm-hmm. And you have that gift of not being a victim, not being obnoxious, kind of that happy middle place of really being able to see what's important, prioritize, not have that tired but wired feeling, not have that, rev. A lot of people have that rev, especially now. And it's very hard to serve in a sustained way when you're running on the rev.
Yeah. I'm sure this is like the question you have to answer a million times, but this is your hit song that you have to sing every time, and everybody loves it. So, but what do you think in terms of the quickest way to get to? Because obviously this is sustained. I mean, the really making a state of change, a lifestyle change, is a sustained change. But what are quick things that people can do during the day that seem to make the biggest difference?
Yeah, I always feel like I want to come up with something totally novel when I get asked that question. Like no one's ever heard of before. So I'll say a couple of things. I mean, this is besides yoga, right? Because besides yoga. If my patients just practice yoga, they wouldn't need me. So my way of looking at this is that I have a functional medicine approach. So I was trained as a conventional doctor, and then I turned left, right? Like I went rogue, right? And I practice integrative and functional medicine now. So there's a couple of things that I found to be helpful. It's maybe easier for me to answer that question with, what do I do now? Yeah. So one thing that's helpful to me is to measure. There are some enlightened beings, perhaps you, who are able to just close their eyes, breathe, and they have a sense of kind of where they are. Yeah. With that neurohormonal dashboard, they can kind of read themselves. Right. And perhaps from my medical training, which now was, like 25 years ago, I lost that conversation. So, from working 120 hours a week and 36-hour shifts, You don't go to the bathroom when you need to go. You don't eat when you need to eat. And so you kind of turn off that conversation, and people have that to varying degrees. So I need to measure my compassionate presence. And the best way that I found for myself is to do it with something called heart rate variability. So this is getting a little techie, but I have a little wearable, a little watch that measures my heart rate variability, and it's got a super simple readout, and it basically just tells me every morning when I start my sadhana, it tells me what % calm I am. And I love this because, like this morning I was 31% calm. And I'm selling a house right now in Berkeley. We just got an offer late last night. We just moved to a new house. I'm traveling this weekend for a speech. There's a lot going on in my life right now. And so 31%, I can live with that. It's not as good as a week ago, but it's a way of base casing kind of the sum total of my hormones, especially cortisol. And tells me where I am, like what do I have to work with today? And what's going to be the practice, the sadhana, that matches where I am. So that's kind of a long answer to your question. For me, even just taking 3 slow, deep breaths with kind of a pause at the top is helpful. There's some supplements that I find to be helpful, but, I would say primarily it's my sadhana that helps me keep that dashboard in place, especially measuring that dashboard. And I also do, a lot of functional medicine testing. I measure these hormones that we're talking about, sometimes quarterly, sometimes every 6 months, because I think that's important too. I don't think it's as simple as, if you have Hashimoto's and you're having a flare, deep breathing is going to help, but it's not going to solve the problem.
No. And what do you think? I mean, I'm curious so if you get some of these, deeper kind of panels and you get the readouts on the hormones, then, because it's all about interpretation. I think this is for me personally, and what I've heard from other people, like, then what do you do? Because if you don't have a doctor who really has obviously there are some doctors who are speaking this language, but they're very few. I mean, you really, like, I have hunted for, besides Yogi Bhajan, there's one other guy in Los Angeles who I think is speaking an interesting language about women's hormones, which is funny because he's kind of like this dude, but somehow he got into that. And there's maybe a couple other people, but this is kind of not really yet. And Yogi Bhajan's prediction is this is the language of the future. But for now, you get those hormonal panels. What's the best thing to do with them? Like, what would you say? What would you tell your sister who lives in Iowa, or what do you do with them to really get the best, your most you can from it?
Well, I think the first strategy is knowledge. So you don't have to get a PhD in biochemistry or endocrinology, but it's kind of amazing that hormonal balance is not that difficult if you've got a model, kind of a simplified model for how the system works. And I don't think of it, I'm trained as a bioengineer, so I don't think of it as, okay, my thyroid's low, I'm just going to top it off a little. Like, that's not my strategy. My strategy is to work with the control system.
Right.
Which is where I think Kundalini yoga really comes in.
100%.
So when you're working with the control system, that means generally you have to work with your stress response, because the control system in my worldview is in the brain, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. You can expand that to include the thyroid and the gonads. So the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal thyroid gonadal axis. I know that's a mouthful, but the idea is that you want to be working with the control system, which usually means that you have to unlock cortisol first.
Right.
So if you've got a thyroid issue, if you've got, if you're like me and you're a bit of a cortisol junkie, I had high cortisol for probably 20 years.
Right.
If you have an issue with your estrogen progesterone balance, maybe you have heavy periods, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, an issue with testosterone. Generally, it starts first with the control system, working with the control system. So what do you do then? I've worked for 20 plus years with that very question and helping women develop protocols for how to solve it. And then I put it into my first book. So my first book is called The Hormone Cure.
Yeah.
And it takes the top 7 hormone issues that women face, with the hormones that we've talked about: cortisol, estrogen, thyroid, progesterone, testosterone. And it offers kind of a gradual progression for how to work with those hormone imbalances. Starting first with the symptoms that you have to kind of self-diagnose, and then you can confirm it with some blood testing or urine testing or saliva testing.
Right.
And then I think it's very important to not jump to a drug. We do too much of that, and drugs tend to mask symptoms instead of help you kind of connect to the innate intelligence of the body and heal from that place. So I start first with lifestyle interventions, including filling in micronutrient gaps, food, yoga, exercise that's dialed in and not always what you think. For some people, they need to exercise less. They need to do something more adaptive, like
a lot of people.
Yeah. Especially those cortisol junkies.
Yes. Yeah.
And then second is botanical therapies. So herbal therapies that have been proven in randomized trials to make a difference. An example is if you're a low progesterone person, you have trouble soothing yourself, and maybe your periods are a little closer together, or you're having trouble getting pregnant. Chasteberry is very effective. Also helps, there's at least 4 randomized trials showing that it helps with premenstrual syndrome. And then if that doesn't work, only after, about 12 weeks of kind of letting your body come to a new steady state, do you move on to hormone therapies, bioidentical hormones at the lowest dose for the shortest duration. So that's the way that I work with, kind of a typical panel that you described.
Yeah. And what panel, I was reading something, Dr. Mercola is talking about this kind of, it seems like a newer hormonal panel. I haven't seen it before, and I'm forgetting what the name of it is. But it looked good. I had a resonance with it. I was like, oh, this looks interesting. Do you know what I'm talking about? Which one I'm talking about?
I don't know what he wrote about, but the panel that I'm liking the most right now, because it changes every couple of years.
Yeah.
I used to be such a huge fan of cortisol testing. I like blood testing because that's kind of the universal language of conventional physicians. And I like to build bridges with conventional physicians, bring them our way.
Yeah.
And then I liked saliva testing for a long time, but there's limitations to saliva testing. It tells you your free hormone levels. It doesn't tell you your metabolism of hormones. And now we know as women, we need to know about metabolism.
Yeah.
So I like dried urine testing. So there's a few labs that do it. There's one based in Oregon that I really like, where you basically pee on a piece of paper 4 times during the day. So it gives you that, the kind of that story all day long of what's happening with your hormones. And you can look at cortisol, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, DHEA, kind of all of these hormones that we're talking about.
Cool. And then you take that, you send away, it's like you send away for your Cracker Jacks, box prize. You get it back, and then, taking that to just your regular physician, you're still going to be able to get some benefit from having them read that, even if they're not, I'm asking this as a question, even if they're not necessarily hip on the women's hormone, or you feel like it's better to look for someone who has more of some sort of, ideology around this. What's your, so for someone who's in a place where they don't feel like, or they can, they have necessarily that resource, they could get that test done, which is awesome. But they could do that and send away for it. But where would you then take it?
Well, I think it's good to start with your clinician, because if you have someone collaborative that you already have established care with, they know your history, they know your context. And so I think that is a good place to start. Unfortunately, the reality is it often doesn't go well.
Right.
Didn't go well for me when I was in my mid-30s.
Yes.
Right? And went to my primary care doctor, and I'm like, I'm a bitch. I don't have sex with my husband. I feel so old. I need help. And he's like, How about an antidepressant?
Right.
So often it doesn't go well, but we're changing that. So I think especially for clinicians who have been through some sort of health crisis of their own. And so, women who've struggled like I've struggled, those are often the ones who are more open-minded and able to look beyond the crap that we learned in medical school.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I learned a lot of great things in medical school, but we had 30 minutes of nutrition. Like Andrew Weil talks about being at Harvard Medical School and how he had 30 minutes of nutrition. And I went to medical school much later than him and still had 30 minutes. Like, it's ridiculous.
Right.
So sometimes it requires becoming a citizen scientist.
Yeah.
And, talking to your girlfriends about it. And, like finding the collaborative relationships that are going to support you. So this lab that I use, Precision Analytics, for the dried urine testing, they have naturopaths that they can connect you with and help you interpret the test. The test itself is very intuitive, and it gives you a report about what's going on with your body. So it's not like you get all these numbers and you have no idea what to do with it.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, that's it's like my first astrology reading my mom got me when I was 11 years old, and they sent it to you. They sent you a printed out reading, and I just remember it was just such a, but it was a interpretation. It was something that even as 11 years old, even though I was busy reading Temple of My Familiar by Alice Walker. I mean, I was an avid reader, but I could understand even though it was in another language, a language I didn't yet know. So that's something people can do. They can actually get an interpretive. That's what comes with this hormone test.
Comes with an interpretation, and
awesome.
This is another place where I think this could be an obstacle for people. We started our conversation today talking about the obstacles that women face.
Yes.
And I think one of the obstacles is that part of internalizing misogyny and patriarchy has been taking our medical care and turning it over to our doctors.
1,000%.
And we are in a place now where that has not worked well for us. And our healthcare system is broken. 70% of healthcare costs are preventable and lifestyle related. And so part of stepping into your power is learning about this enchanting, fascinating organism that is carrying your soul around.
Yeah.
And so, you don't have to go to medical school, but you can learn about the basics of hormones. You could read my first book and you would know more than most physicians if you just read my first book and focused on the hormones that are out of whack for you. Yeah. So I'm not saying that's the only way, but I think this is another way that we turn over our power.
Yes.
And that needs to end right now, because there is nothing more fascinating than kind of understanding your own physiology and how you're kind of dealing with your environment. That's where it all starts. That's where the magic starts, with transformation and doing the work that we're meant to do.
Yeah, what we report in the yogic community in terms of even women who aren't, they may not have an everyday practice or even a very long practice, but women who have some sort of breath and dynamic movement practice that has a intention about it, which can be so many different things, but I'm not even speaking directly to Kundalini. But the report is that, and the more sophisticated you get, the more sophisticated this gets, but is that they feel the moment of conception. They all these things that seem to have been this kind of obtuse externalized experience in just the past, actually just the past, not even very long, of the externalized kind of experience of where we put God outside of ourselves, the doctor outside of ourselves, this whatever, the power structure outside of ourselves. ourselves. But these women, they report, I felt the moment of conception. I felt the ovum, attached to all these things that seem like these stories of women. I didn't even know I was pregnant till 5 months pregnant. You hear those kinds of stories and you're like, how possible could we be that far away from this? And the same is with these subtle processes of the endocrine system and the hormonal system. And these are tangible if you are sensory enough. In my experience as a woman and a yogi, they're tangible experiences, almost like somebody's talking to you in regular. If you learn the language, which is just a different type of sensitivity, it is tangible. And I think it's a beautiful message because it's tangible to any woman, just like we're all psychic. Everyone has the capacity and human, but for women, because this is a more complex language in some way, just the language of a woman's body. I think it's so important to know that just a little bit of some conscious breath could give you that experience of, okay, this is what's gone off a little bit, and all I need to do is, and then there's some things that you can do that we've talked about. Yogi Bhajan says women need to stretch their elbows. I don't know if you have some science behind that. He said women need to stretch their elbows. He said 11-minute naps twice a day will take the cortisol down quite a bit. And then he gave all sorts of other things. 5 miles a day of walking was a big Yogi Bhajan thing, which I've been doing and totally has balanced my hormones.
What I love about what you just said is that you've simplified the science of hormones down to its essence, which is that it's a language that we need to learn. It's not some rarefied language of just a few people. It's not some complex language that is owned by physicians. Mm-hmm. It is a universal language, no different than learning Spanish.
Yeah.
So when I learned Spanish, it was a little bit complicated. Like it took me a few months to kind of get the hang of it. And then I could converse. And that's what we want. Like that's what is available and accessible to us. So I also want to speak to what you said about Yogi Bhajan, about this idea of 2 naps a day for 11 minutes and walking 5 miles, because there's really interesting evidence with this. We know that when I went through medical training, we were told that naps were a terrible idea, that they disrupt the sleep architecture, and then they screw up your night of sleep. And the latest evidence, the latest neuroscience is that naps are such a gift. They actually count as double the sleep that you get at night. So 2 11-minute naps, I can't speak to that specifically, but a 30-minute nap counts as like an hour at night. So for people who have trouble getting, kind of their full 7 to 8.5 hours every night, you can definitely make up the difference with naps. And it really makes a difference in terms of your neurohormonal dashboard. Because one night of bad sleep totally screws up your cortisol. It makes you hungrier the next day. It affects your decision making. Your decisions are not as clean when it comes to your food, when it comes to your relationships, when it comes to, kind of your next right action. The other thing, this 5 miles of walking, it's so interesting that you said that and that it's working for you. I want to hear more about that, because walking is I think underrated. And I had this experience when I was writing my first book where I sat way too much. And I started to get inflamed. I gained a bunch of weight. And part of it was that I was seeing patients during the day. And then I was sitting at home by myself after my kids went to bed and writing this book and drinking a glass or 2 of wine. So I got inflamed.
Right.
And so with my future books, one of the things I did was I got a treadmill desk. And so I'm also walking 5 miles a day like you are. And it just makes such a difference in terms of the matrix of my body.
Yes.
And my hormonal balance. But I want to hear more from you about these practices and how they're helping you.
Yeah, I knew about this walking teaching for a long time, and then I started traveling more, and with the travel, as you know, a lot of more stress on the body. But I also noticed that I was walking a lot more, and even if my diet was different, I actually would end up losing weight in these, you know, kind of planes and trains and automobiles, but in eating Italian food. And my teacher loves Italian food. So when we're on the road with my teacher, it's like 3 meals a day, Italian food. And so, and of course, you know, I'm a moon juice, you know, raw foodist in my 20s, you know, so I had to like really kind of get with, okay, all right, you know, what does this look like for me? But we would walk a lot. And so that was the first indication for me that something, but now I've gotten so into it and, you know, gotten into the science of it and gotten into how it really starts to activate kind of the more ancient vitality, literally in the genes. I feel that, but I wanted to know what actually is that. And so Yogi Bhajan, the yogic sciences, he said women 5 miles a day and you won't have the issues that most women complain of as they get older if you walk 5 miles a day. And so I had all of my women around the world and like all of my women's training programs start to do this. And amazing things just being reported. So this is my, you know, kind of mad science, because I always want empirical evidence. I want to know like what happens to the women who have 4 children or the women who live in cold environments or the women, you know, is there a difference between women who are doing it on a treadmill and women who are going outside and women who, you know, what's the difference? And so we started to compile all this kind of just information. We haven't necessarily done anything with it yet, but I'm watching both for myself and everyone else, all these other women, you know, what's happened. And the reports are major mental health benefits, major. What seems to be a lot of cortisol, and we're talking like, I think a lot of times, like my mom used to do the walking every night. We lived by the canals in kind of the Potomac River canals in the East Coast, and like she had her girlfriends and they would do like that 80s like power walk, but which was adorable and good fitness. But I've been encouraging actually more of the kind of walking where you're really able to talk and stroll and smell a flower and like not exercise walking, you know, and kind of taking it out of that. You can do a little of that too, but like outside of, but like strolling and just what it would be like in a more ancient time of getting from point A to B and all that kind of stuff. And just women losing weight, their skin looking better, they're just a lot of like what we would say symptomatics of hormones being more imbalanced, mental health, reproductive stuff, certainly like periods, PMS, even perimenopausal and postmenopausal women feeling, you know, losing weight easier or feel like the stomach flattening, you know, things that you wouldn't expect if we're coming at it from a more kind of Western fitness minded type A, or you're calling it cortisol addicted. Is that what you called it? Or junkie? Yeah, which I definitely have. And you know, before this, I was doing, you know, when the stress went up in my life, I had kind of become more of a heavy exerciser with my yoga, and it totally inflamed me. And that was when I really got personally that I was like, whoa, this, and now I'm in my 30s, not in my 20s. And now, you know, what's the difference here? Because I'm a mover, I'm athletic. I like to move, but what's the difference? So that's what my short kind of answer is, that it has been fundamental. And then of course we found, you know, I had to find the cute Fitbit. So we're all trying to get our style going with our Fitbits and like our vibes going. But no, it's been pretty monumental, the shifts in all of the women in different ages and different places and different, you know, parts of their life and cycles of their life. So I think there's a real key here in the walking.
Well, I totally agree with you. And it's, I'd love to analyze that data with you, because I think there's some important truths that you're collecting.
Yeah.
And just, you know, putting my science hat on for a moment, I would say a couple things. I mean, we started at the beginning talking about forest bathing. And, yes, forest bathing is fantastic. I happen to live some distance from a forest, so I can't just like walk out my front door and get that forest medicine. But I can walk to a hillside, and I can do it with my dog and with my husband, my beloved husband. And I can get some of that medicine that you're talking about. So it's not, kind of this narrow focus of, I've got to get my 12,000 steps today. It's more of like that compassionate presence and moving your body. What we know from a scientific perspective is that walking is one of the best things you can do. It's hard to do it wrong because alignment is not as hard with walking as it is with sitting or with running. So if you sit, I'm sitting right now, and if you have, kind of that forward tilt of your pelvis and you're putting, if you have that kind of anterior tilt on your pelvis, it can put up to 400% increased stress on your lower spine.
Right.
So sitting well is very difficult to do. Running is very difficult to do.
Very difficult, yeah.
Because you've got to get the alignment right. Women have more knee issues when they run. Running raises cortisol. You're talking about exercising more when you travel. And what we know with the female body is that when you travel, when you get on a plane, it requires about 2 to 3x the demand on your adrenals. So kind of the amount that you need from your adrenal function goes up 2 to 3-fold every time you travel across the country. So that's a lot. And, some people have difficulty keeping up with that demand, and then other things suffer. They don't sleep well. They, feel exhausted for several days after they land in their new place. And so we want to be thinking about, okay, how do we adapt to our lifestyle? So I'm traveling to Chicago this weekend. And I can't go to Chicago and like do a CrossFit session. Like that's not going to be a good thing. Or go running. Like it's going to raise my cortisol after a flight that has 2 to 3x the demand. So that's a mismatch between what my body needs as a woman and what I would get from my environment. So what's much better for me is to have a sadhana, to have a practice, or to go walking. So I agree with you. I think there's something really special about walking, and it's, sitting makes you fat and inflamed and decreases cognitive function. So the more that we're on our feet and walking, the better.
Yeah. I feel it. I mean, I sit for a living in a different way, even though it's conscious sitting, it's still that you still are, I feel the kind of effects of, there does feel to be some sort of difference because you see some of these masters who've sat and sat and sat and sat, and they're not, but they're men as well. So this is part of the back to the mutation conversation of just, I do feel, and something I certainly have been meditating and really feel part of my mission is you don't see a lot of models of spiritual teachers who, or whatever, people who are running a lot of spirit through the body, however you want to put that, because I think spiritual teacher can be used in a weird way, but people who are running a lot of spirit through the body, a lot of times you see the body kind of break down and not remain vital. And then there are some examples of vitality, but it can, that I've seen just a lot of Yogi Bhajan had a lot of physical problems. Many, we would say Amma's a bigger kind of woman, which is totally beautiful. But like, what does it look like in this kind of new model for to be able to run a lot of energy through the body and not have the repercussions of the hormones and stuff. So that I feel like is part of this mutation process of kind of what does it feel, what does it look like? But when you're sitting all the time, a lot of that kind of lower energy is cut off, which is part of the reason the yogis did it, because a lot of them were celibate and all that kind of stuff. But it's an interesting thing. I just want to quickly, because it is something you talk about so much, and maybe you could just give us a little dash into the exposome and that conversation, and younger. I see it behind you. I'm reading all the books behind you that you have on your shelf. Ah, thanks. That's so sweet. But thank you. Thank you so much. So what is there anything in that kind of conversation in Younger and about exposome that would be of benefit for, people, and they can obviously and should pick up your book and all of your books. I mean, your first book, which I have not read, but I'm going to now, that's having that laid out that way, that is a huge gift. I'm so excited to read it. I'm just like, so anyways, but with Younger and this, and I'm sure I don't know if this is the first kind of foray into this, or you had talked about it in the earlier books, the exposome.
No, not much, because it's a newer concept. So I'll explain what it is. And this may relate back to running that spiritual energy through your body. I think a lot about subtle energetic anatomy and how do we direct that flow of energy. How does it interact with the more Western concepts of anatomy? Yeah. But let me talk about exposome for a moment. So we talked earlier about if you look at chronic disease, like, I have Alzheimer's disease in my family, for instance. Right. Only about 10% of your risk of chronic disease is genetic. Right. 90% is your environment. And when it comes to the environment, what you can do is you can actually calculate your environmental exposures. So a lot of people think of the environment and they feel like a lot of it they don't have control over, getting exposed to toxins like endocrine disruptors and heavy metals, the relationships that you have and the kind of physiology that they can generate in your body. Certain tendencies that you might have in terms of your genetics for your neurohormonal dashboard, and then how the environment interacts with those things. So that 10% is genetic, the 90% is environment. And you can measure that environmental impact with the exposome. So the exposome is the aggregate of your environmental exposures, some of which are external, so kind of being done to you. So I'm flying to Chicago this weekend. I'm going to be sitting in a plane with flame retardants and, recircled air full of viruses. And, there's lots of different things that I don't really want to get exposed to. Mm-hmm. And then there's also what happens inside your body in response to your environment. So that includes your gut physiology, like the microbes in your gut and how they interact with your environment, the food that you eat, especially the toxins that you get exposed to, like pesticides on foods. Many of them can poke holes in your gut and lead to problems with the gut-brain axis. Right. So you can measure your exposome, and you can also optimize your exposome. So exposome is kind of a complicated idea. It's still relatively new from a scientific point of view, but it's another part of that empowerment that I think we have, where you have so much more control over your exposome than you may realize.
And is this also something that you measure in terms of a test, or this is just is this a measurable thing at this point in terms of empirically?
Yeah, I haven't seen commercially available tests that kind of measure your entire exposome. It's a little hard to do because there's so many different exposures, but I'll give you a few examples. There's a test by Genova, which is a lab in North Carolina, called the NutriVal. So it's a blood and the urine test, and they measure a lot of exposome variables. They measure your heavy metal exposures, for instance. And I'm missing the gene that helps me process heavy metals, so I tend to be toxic in mercury. And it measures micronutrients, like how your food is being absorbed and any gaps that you might have in your micronutrients. So a quick example of that is for people who don't get enough vitamin C, that can lead to a problem with their progesterone levels. And progesterone is like nature's Valium. It's kind of the way that we soothe ourselves. It's in a tango with estrogen. You want to have a really good dance between those two hormones. And so being low in vitamin C can be part of your exposome and a gap that you want to fill.
Yes. Yes.
So I don't know of a single test that measures everything in your exposome, but
Right.
that's probably coming in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah. Really interesting, very fascinating. And also, I think these are the moments where I know it's like people take this in, especially in the natural health world and in the wellness world, like this becomes another way that we've internalized the patriarchy, basically, like that what we're doing wrong or what, you know, you just see the kind of how people back themselves into the corner around, you know, what they're allergic to or what they're doing, you know, what they're, and all this kind of thing. And so this is where I feel like a lot of the mind training of the sadhana comes in, where it's, can you really take a look at what you are exposing yourself to and being exposed to on whatever levels, environmental, emotionally, psychologically. And then you start to decide, like, what can you, X amount of time, X amount of energy, what can you handle in the exposure? Like, if you know you have to travel a lot, maybe you should eat better or be careful about your heavy metals, or, you know, these are the kind of, and I think that becomes like a householder's way of just looking at these things, cutting through your own self-deception, but also not like getting super heavy neurotic about it. Because I do think this is where the, you know, this kind of dance is very, yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine, I had him on the podcast, and Luke Story, and Luke is just, I mean, like in every pocket, there's, you know, like a clip onto his nostrils and like an adaptogen to take, and the nootropics, and he just got from the infrared, and he's detoxing his heavy metals, and I'm like, whoa, man. And he said to me, he actually admitted, it was really cute. He was like, yeah, I'm not feeling very good. Like, he's doing all of that, and he's not feeling very good. So I feel like there is like that space of where we can make our kind of own self-deception, cutting through that, really a place of vitality. Even though, you know, we're exposed, you go on the thing, you're going to be exposed to virus if you're on a plane, or you're going to be, you know, everyone's always hacking, coughing. That's every plane I've been on in the past like 3 months. I mean, there's like literally someone with like walking pneumonia sitting next to me. Like, it's like Murphy's Law.
Yeah. Well, amen, sister. I feel like you have tapped into something so important here, because it's we need the voice of reason. Yeah. And in many ways, that's what sadhana does for me. It provides me with the voice of reason, so that I'm not getting too neurotic, I'm not getting too oblivious or like falling asleep at the wheel, but I'm finding this kind of happy middle. And, you know, the quickest little scientific example of the point that you're making is that the main barrier between you and your environment is your gut wall. And there's places where it's just one cell layer thick. So it's a very vulnerable layer. And the more that you're able to kind of modulate and be a witness or an observer of the way that you run cortisol in your body, kind of the way that you run that HPA, the control system for your hormones, the more you're able to protect that barrier. So if you're like I was in my mid-30s, when I was complaining of the PMS and the weight gain and, you know, feeling like a bitch to my doctor, I wasn't the mistress of my cortisol levels. I wasn't working with my neuroendocrine system in a masterful way. And that's, to me, that's part of the promise of having a sadhana. So if you're someone like I was in my 30s who has high cortisol, so I was like high cortisol first thing in the morning, that was poking holes in my gut wall. And it was allowing all these things to go through my gut wall that I didn't want to go through, things like gluten and, you know, other problems. So at its most simple, you know, the more that you're able to manage that neuroendocrine system and, you know, kind of take care of those vulnerable sides of yourself, like your gut lining, the better.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a beautiful way of putting it. And I am so grateful for this conversation. I feel like I could talk to you forever. You're such an amazing woman, and just I bless you for the work that you're doing. And thank you for educating our listeners and all of that you're doing in the world. And I can't wait to spend more time with you. How do people find you?
The best place to find me is at saragottfriedmd.com. You can also go to the book website for the latest book, Younger, where we talk about exposome and the 90-10 rule, and that's theyoungerbook.com. And I just want to thank you for the incredible work that you do in the world. I feel like you have made yoga and Kundalini yoga cool again, and it's a stunning achievement.
Thank you.
And damn, it looks so good on you.
I
really am so grateful for the gifts that you have given the world.
Thank you. Right back at you. And we're going to, I'm prophesizing this. We are going to spend more time together.
Yes.
So thank you. Safe travels and see you soon. Satnam.
Satnam.